What, according to you, is the difference between a strategic analyst and a business analyst?
I think the main difference lies in the scope. So for a strategic analyst, the scope is more of a macro. I think it's an eagle's eye view. For a business analyst, it's more micro. And I feel both have to be there individually. You cannot expect one individual to go macro and micro. It's extremely difficult to switch perspectives, which is why you need both in an organization. So just to give you an example of how what my experience has been, so I've been in the strategic analyst role and I've been working with the business analysts of the company. And how we work is in iterations. So I'm looking at things from more of a macro standpoint. So let's say we're looking at the gross margins of the company vis-a-vis the competitors, and we feel we are like 2 percentage points short of the top quartile. So we feel we can do better as from a competitive standpoint. So that's the point I raise, and that's what the business analysts take up. That now they start trying to figure out how do they really cut down on that 2 percentage points of the costs? How do they make up that margin? And then I get an iteration from them that these are probably the areas we can work upon. So let's see how our competitors are faring in these areas, and then we get into those specific areas and we try to figure out where are they beating us, and then that's the iteration that goes there. And then if that's if we figure out a way how we've done it, great, we make up for that difference of 2 percentage points. If not, then again the question comes back to me that we aren't being able to figure out a way how to do this. How are the competitors doing it? So then I go into the competitors' history. Right? Did they make any strategic calls? Did they undergo some major transformation in terms of the way they're doing their business? Any partnerships? Anything that could really make up for that difference? And then that's the feedback that happens. Right? You need both. As a strategic analyst, I'm looking more at the overall scheme of things, and as a business analyst, well, strictly speaking, they're looking into the processes of the company. How can they streamline it better? And now that we're living in the era of tech, how can tech come in to really better the business processes, which is what we call systems or IT in common parlance. I think that's the difference that lies between a strategic and a business analyst.
Okay, all right. That's so if anyone has to shift between both of these lines, is that even possible?
Yeah, I think it would be possible. There's really no reason why it wouldn't be possible, but I feel the transition is easier from a business analyst role to a strategic analyst, because I feel you should always have a fair sense or understanding of the ground level realities before really looking at things from a macro perspective. Of course, the transition can happen the other way around as well, just that you carry that macro thoughts into that specific business process or that micro area. But I guess even that works out pretty well, because when you've seen the overall scheme of things, a very simple example, when you're in an organization at a micro level, you're a part of the entire process. So you're too focused on what you're doing. You're not concerned about what happens before and after. You're too focused on perfecting your area of things. But the moment you've had that exposure of looking at things from a macro standpoint, your entire perspective changes. No matter what you do, you immediately start thinking that, okay, if I do this, the guy behind me is gonna, probably it's gonna impact them in this way. The team after me is gonna impact them in this way. So the perspective changes. So I guess the movement is pretty simple, because the underlying skills needed for both the roles are the same. I don't think there's much of a difference in the skills you need for the two roles, unless you get into the technicalities of things. But yeah, I think both are pretty much similar in terms of the skill set. So you can move between the two.
That's great. Okay, that's wonderful. That again takes me to the next question. What do you think are the skills that would be required for someone who wants to get into as a strategic analyst?
Right. So I feel there are two skills, macro skills, that are needed for any strategic analyst. And one of them being a strong sense of logic, and the other having a really open mind. And I'll give you the logic behind the two. So first is having a strong sense of logic, because in my role, generally what I've seen is that there's a macro question that comes from the top level management. Something as simple as, why is this XYZ competitor doing better than us? Either in terms of the traction they're getting with the clients or the industry reviews or the overall scheme of things. And As an analyst, what you're expected to do is really understand what are the different causes behind that. So you break that macro question into these smaller questions. You look into the different areas in terms of the costs, the revenues, the target market, how have they positioned themselves, and you try to answer each of these things, back it up with data, and finally you come up with that macro solution that okay, this is what what's the reason behind the difference between us, and what we can do to overcome this. So this requires a really strong sense of logic going just beyond numbers, because earlier when I used to feel that everything, all the answers come from numbers, but when it comes to the ground level reality of things, there's a dearth of numbers out there. You will not get numbers that easily. The best example, if you look at US private companies, the numbers are not available anywhere, on no public forum, on no government website, nothing. So the moment there's a dearth of numbers, it gets more and more complex. So then you have to look at logic, you have to look at a lot of other things. So that's needed as an analyst. And the other point about having an open mind is because my own experience has been that over the last couple of years out here in this company, I've been involved in projects related to HR, marketing, finance, the ops, and even technology to some extent. And that would not have been possible. I would not have been really able to play a role there if I didn't keep an open mind, because those are not my areas. Finance is my area, marketing, I've had that exposure, it's my area. But the other three, technically, they're not my area. So I need to have that open mind, do some research, uh, learn on the go, educate myself on the job, and value add in whatever way I can. So I guess for a strategic analyst, given the role that they're in, given the kind of people they're dealing with, where you can get involved in projects in any which way, you really need to have an open mind. So these are the two skills.
Okay, great. That's amazing. And you had also mentioned about asking the right questions for the logic to come. So that's a great answer. Thank you for that. Moving on, Varun. What are the internal and the external tools which are used for the analysis?
Hmm. I feel that internal and external, it all comes down to data. Yeah, there are different tools for getting access to data externally, but then you generally begin with your internal data. So as an analyst, you know this is the kind of data you need. So you have the finance team, you have the ops team, they have their respective data. You get that from them, you do your own working on them, the crunching, the cleansing of the data. You see what trends are coming out. But that's not enough, because at the end of the day, this is your internal data. And it's absolute data, to be honest. There's no relativity. How do I know this is good? Let's say with the data, I come up to some KPI that, you have a 98% rate in some operational KPI. How do I know that's good? I have to match it with some external benchmarks to really know whether we're on the positive or the negative side of things. So that is where the external data comes in. You look at the industry standards, you look at industry medians, the top quartiles, you look at how the competitors are faring. That is where the different tools come in. I feel there are a lot of databases out there, Bloomberg, CapIQ, uh, there's Morningstar. So all of these databases are there, but again, I feel the scope gets limited some way or the other. Again, going back to the example of US private company, their data is not available on any of these databases because they're simply not required by law to share the data. So in those dire circumstances, it all comes down to that thing we call secondary research, which is just going in depth into Google and just searching for stuff. So at times, what you have to do is go back years, maybe more than a decade, into the old news articles of maybe one of the competitors. Maybe the CEO, CFO at that point of time passed a comment, and that becomes a data point for you. And you try to extrapolate that into the future, maybe the past. You try to get some relation, something or the other. So these are the internal and external tools. Internal, there are no tools, it's just data. Externally, yeah, it's all about how you get access to data, because there is a lot of dirt of data. As a student, I always used to feel that I'll be sitting and I'll be having millions of rows of data in front of me and I'll just be looking at the relation. But first day of the job, I was told that find the data yourself. And that's why I was stumped. So
Okay.
that's what happens in reality.
Okay, that was interesting.
Right.
Right. Moving on. That brings us to our last question. which is the importance of analyzing the macro information that could possibly affect a firm's operation.
Right. I think I'll give you three examples in that sense. So number one is if you look at any annual report of a company, you will come across this section called Management's Discussion and Analysis, or the MDA. That section is all about the management commenting on the global economy, the economy to which you belong, maybe India, maybe Singapore, maybe Russia, anything. And they're also commenting on stating facts about the industry. That's because they know that the investors are going to know the prospects of the industry. Because if the industry is bound for doom, there's really not much any company can do to get out of it, right? And if the industry is just bound for glory, it gives them more confidence that the investment is in the right place. The second example being if you generally look at how HNIs or the institutional investors decide on how to utilize the investable corpuses, they don't look at individual companies at first. The entire corpus is divided across countries, developed economies, developing economies. Within that, they look at the different asset classes, the different industries that have lure that they feel there's a lot of potential, which in today's date in India would be edutech and fintech. Based on that, they narrow down on which companies they feel have the most prospects within that industry. So unless you have a good hold of the macro scheme of things, you cannot really take the right calls for your company as well. So macro really plays a big role. The biggest example I feel is, we look at e-commerce, and COVID has done a lot for e-commerce in 2020, changed the game altogether. So e-commerce is really booming. Now we have two different companies at two different ends of it. One is eBay, one is Amazon. E-commerce is growing, Amazon is growing at a faster pace. That means the investors are more than happy because these guys are getting a greater share of the growth year after year. eBay, on the other hand, it's either they're seeing degrowth or they've stagnated, but there's really not much happening. So the investors, to be crude, they're even more pissed off because an industry that's growing, you're nowhere close to that growth rate. So even an investor is going to benchmark your company versus the industry. Are you in the subpar category or your above par category? That's what determines what kind of valuation you get. How positive is the market sentiment about your company? So macros are pretty important because if the ship is bound to sink, well, bare minimum chance you're going to survive, right? So immediately they're going to be cautious about your company as well. And even the management should be cautious about it because if they're seeing the industry move in the wrong direction, they have to brace for impact. They have to do some things, probably uh, focus more on profitability because the next 3 4 years are going to be about survival rather than growth. And if the industry is going for a growth, you do not want to be the company that brings a knife to a gunfight. You don't want to be someone who's focusing more on profits and cash. Because if you know the industry is going to grow what 200 300% year on year, you want to pump in as much cash as you can to get as many clients as you can. And then the profitability can come later. So unless you know where the industry is heading, you cannot be in sync with it. You might just be on the wrong side of it. So it's really, really, really important.
Okay. Wow, you explained them with such nice examples.
Super, super. I'm glad.